Verified history is in Place, Wyoming cattle country after the 1886 to 1887 die-off Union Pacific at Cheyenne, Fort Hays horse contracts. Writing the full narrative now. They said Emmett Briggs could read a horse the way a preacher reads scripture, patient and certain, as though the answer had always been there, waiting to be found. He had worked ranches from the Cimarron country of Kansas to the open range along the Powder River in Montana, and in 15 years of handling difficult animals, he had never once been thrown. Other men said it for him, the way stories travel through country where there is not much else to carry. When he rode through the gate of the Cooper Ranch on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1888, 3 hands stopped what they were doing to watch. The Union Pacific had been running cattle east out of Cheyenne for 20 years by then, and Laramie County had learned to notice a man who arrived with a reputation tied to his saddle rather than his name. Emmett was quieter than they expected. Most men with a name ride like they know you are looking. Emmett did not. He came in at an easy walk, his eyes moving across the yard, the way they move across unfamiliar ground, not suspicious, just reading. The fence line, the water trough, the place near the far corral where the dirt was churned and scuffed, where something large and unhappy had been pacing. He looked at that last thing a moment longer than the rest. Josiah Cooper met him in the yard. Broad man, gray at the temples, the kind of rancher who had built something real after the hard winters that followed the cattle die-off of 1886 and 87, when a third of the northern herds were lost, and Wyoming ranchers learned the cost of pride the hard way. Josiah had been a member of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association since its founding in 1872, and he had kept his operation standing when others had not. He shook Emmett's hand once and got to the point. The horse was a 4-year-old stallion, a bloodline animal bought at considerable cost from a breeder outside Abilene, Kansas, meant to anchor the ranch's future breeding program. He had papers, he had promise in every line of him. He had put 2 men on the ground and refused every hand since. Cooper was a widower with 1 daughter and 30 years of ranch behind him. Her name was Elsie. A rancher's son named Holt had been calling on her since spring. Good family, his own land north of Cheyenne, the kind of match that made fathers sleep easier. The arrangement made sense in every way that arrangements are supposed to make sense. Elsie had not said otherwise. She was not the kind of woman who said otherwise. Though Wyoming had granted women the vote since 1869, and Elsie used hers quietly when it mattered. Cooper walked Emmett to the far corral. The stallion stood at the back of it, dark as charcoal, watching them approach, with his ears neither forward nor back. A horse that had learned to wait before deciding anything. The hands drifted over without being asked. The foreman, 2 younger men. They waited for Emmett to do something. He stood at the rail and watched the horse. A full minute passed. Then another. He watched the stallion's left ear track sound the way a good ear should. He watched the hindquarters hold tension differently than the shoulders. Not rage, something older than rage. He watched the way the animal breathed, and the way it would not look directly at the fence post nearest the gate. He turned to Cooper, who handled him first after he arrived. The foreman started to answer. Cooper raised a hand. Then a voice came from behind them, even and unhurried, the kind of voice that does not form itself for the room. Roped from the right side on arrival. Blanket thrown before he settled. Cinched before he stopped trembling. Elsie stood a few feet back from the fence, as though she had tried to give herself a reason to be somewhere else and failed. She was watching the horse the way someone watches a thing they have been worrying about alone for a long time. Cooper said her name once. Elsie. The yard went quiet, the way yards do when a man reminds everyone of the order of things. She held a moment longer than she should have. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, her shoulders straight, not hurrying. Emmett watched her go. Then he turned back to the stallion and said there was a north pen on most ranches this size, and he would work the horse there if Cooper had one. Cooper did. They moved the horse that afternoon, and Emmett did not ask whose idea the South Corral had been, because he already knew nobody had thought to ask her. He started before sunrise not because anyone asked him to, but because that was when the yard was empty and the light was thin, and a horse that had been mishandled would sometimes stand easier when there was nothing around that felt like an audience. He brought nothing into the north pen the first morning. No rope, no saddle blanket, no bridle. Just empty hands and the center of the pen, and the stallion deciding what to do about him. The stallion decided to stay at the far end and watch. He did this for 3 mornings, stood, moved slowly when he moved, left when the horse's breathing told him it was enough. The hands watched the first morning and lost interest by the second. There was nothing to see. That was the point. Cooper came by the pen once each evening, stood at the rail for a few minutes, and said nothing. He was a patient man in most things. Emmett could see him working at being patient in this. On the 4th morning, Emmett brought a rope, not to use, just to carry. He draped it over his shoulder and stood in the pen, the same as before, and let the stallion work out that the rope was not going to move unless he moved it. The stallion's ears went back for a while. Then they came forward again. Small thing. Nobody watching would have marked it. But Elsie did. He had not heard her come to the fence. He did not know how long she had been standing there when he finally turned and found her, both hands on the top rail, watching the horse with an expression that had nothing performed in it. He walked to the fence. She did not step back. Her eyes stayed on the stallion's hindquarters. Her voice was low and even. Not ropes in general, just anything that comes near their flank. He looked at the horse, then back at her. How long have you known that? She kept her eyes on the stallion since the week he arrived. He nodded once. She turned and walked back toward the house before anything else could be said, her steps even across the dry ground. He thought about that on the walk back to the bunkhouse, about a woman who had carried the answer for weeks, while men with ropes and spurs kept getting it wrong. About how the Cheyenne Depot had been finished the year before, grand and permanent, while this ranch still could not hear what its own daughter already knew. The next morning he kept the rope on his left shoulder away from the horse's right side entirely. The stallion walked 3 steps toward him before stopping. 3 steps. He stood still and let it mean what it meant. He did not look toward the fence, but he knew she was there. The stallion accepted a blanket on the 8th day, not without protest. He moved away twice, circled the pen, came back to it the way nervous animals do when they decide the thing they fear has not hurt them yet. Emmett laid the blanket across his back and let him feel the weight of it until the breathing slowed. Elsie was at the fence when he came out of the pen. She had been coming most mornings now, early enough that the yard was still quiet. Her father had said nothing further about it. They hung the blanket over the rail, and both watched the stallion move to the water trough and drink. After a while, she asked how many horses he had done this with. More than I can name. You stop counting after a while. Same way a carpenter stops counting tables. Are they all like this one? A specific fear in a specific place. Every one of them. Most people just do not look for it. She was quiet, her arms resting on the top rail. Without turning her head, she said, they told stories about him in Cheyenne, about a stallion in Abilene that no other hand could touch. Mostly true, he said, with some parts added that were not. She glanced at him, then just briefly, sidelong, and he got the sense she was revising something. Not her opinion of him exactly, more like the picture she had built around his name before he arrived, measuring it against the man standing at this fence. You did not look like much when you rode in. There was no cruelty in it. Most horses that can do real work do not look like much either. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, brief and controlled, there and gone, before it became anything she would have to account for. She pushed off the rail and said she had things to see to. She walked back toward the house the same way she always did, straight-backed and unhurried, not looking over her shoulder. Emmett stayed at the fence longer than he needed to. If you have come this far into a quiet morning at a Wyoming corral, we hope you will stay. Subscribe if these stories feel like home to you, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. There is more ahead, and we would be glad to have you with us. The first ride came on a morning with no particular ceremony to it. Emmett had the saddle on the stallion the day before, just the weight of it. No cinch, no rider, just the leather sitting across his back, while the stallion stood in the pen and breathed and decided it was not going to harm him. That had taken the better part of an hour. Emmett had stood beside him the whole time with one hand on his neck, not moving, not rushing, letting the horse do the work of accepting it. The next morning he cinched it slowly, with long pauses between each adjustment, keeping his hands away from the hindquarters, keeping his voice low and even when he spoke at all. The stallion's ears went back twice. Both times Emmett stopped and waited until they came forward again before continuing. When the cinch was set, he stood beside the horse a long while longer. Then he put his foot in the stirrup. The stallion shifted his weight, but did not move off. Emmett stayed there, one foot up, one hand on the saddle horn, letting the horse feel the added pressure and decide about it. A full minute passed. Then he came up slowly, swung his leg over, and settled into the saddle as quietly as a man sitting down to breakfast. The stallion stood. His ears were forward. His breathing was fast, but not panicked. The breathing of something alert, not afraid. Emmett sat still and kept his hands soft on the reins and let the horse feel the weight of him and understand that the weight was not going to do anything sudden. After a while, the stallion took one step, then another. They moved in a slow, wide circle around the pen, nothing more than a walk, and the stallion's head came down by degrees until he was moving with his neck long and easy. The pen was quiet around them, except for hooves on packed dirt and the occasional shift of saddle leather. Elsie was at the fence. She had both hands on the top rail, and she was not moving, and she was not looking away. Her face had the look it sometimes got when something she had believed privately for a long time was being proved in front of other people. Not triumphant, just quietly certain. The way a person looks when the world finally catches up to what they already knew. Emmett brought the stallion to a stop near the center of the pen. He sat there a moment, then looked toward the fence. Their eyes met across the pen, and neither of them said anything. And neither of them needed to. Holt rode in on a Friday afternoon, which was when he usually came. The cook started earlier. The hands straightened up without being told. Cooper came by the north pen at midday, looked at the stallion for a long moment, and said the horse was looking better. Emmett said he was coming along. Cooper nodded and walked back toward the house to receive his guest. Dinner at the Cooper table was a serious thing on the nights Holt came. The good dishes, the lamp turned up. Holt spoke well. He listened when Cooper spoke. He laughed at the right moments. He asked after the ranch hands by name. He was correct with Elsie, attentive without pressing, interested without demanding. There was nothing to fault in any of it. She kept her hands in her lap between courses and answered what she was asked and watched the candle burn down in its holder. Her father brought up the stallion over the second course, proud, the way he was always proud when an investment moved in the right direction. Holt nodded along, cutting his meat. He is a fine animal. Good lines on him, though I will admit I expected more progress by now. "How many weeks has it been?" Cooper said, "Nearly 3. My father's breaker could put a green horse under saddle in 4 days. Good hand. Never had much trouble. Though I suppose a bloodline animal is a different matter." Cooper turned his glass in his hand. "Briggs knows what he is doing." "I am sure he does. Just an observation." Elsie moved a piece of potato from one side of her plate to the other. After dinner, their voices carried through the window from the porch, low and comfortable, the sound of 2 men who understood each other's arithmetic. Elsie washed the good dishes herself, slowly, listening to the water run over her hands in the dark kitchen. Her mother's wedding ring caught the lamplight once and went dark again. She had worn it on the chain around her neck since she was 16, and some evenings the weight of it still surprised her. That evening, Elsie came to the fence later than usual, her collar turned up against the chill that came early across Laramie County in autumn. "My father is pleased with how the visit went." Emmett waited. "Holt thinks the stallion just needs a firm hand. That patience is fine up to a point, but eventually the horse has to understand who is in charge. What do you think?" The stallion moved to the water trough and drank. "I think the horse already knows who is in charge. That is not what he is trying to work out." She pulled her collar tighter and walked back toward the house. Emmett latched the pen gate and stood in the cooling dark. The horse knew who was in charge. What he was working out was whether the man in charge was worth trusting. Emmett thought that was a reasonable thing to need to know. The Army officer arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into the work. His name was Carver, lean and straight-backed, a letter of introduction from the Quartermaster Corps at Fort Hays in Kansas, and 2 men behind him. Fort Hays had been supplying cavalry horses to the plains for more than 20 years, and Carver spoke as though the fort would stand forever, though Emmett knew country well enough to understand that nothing stood forever except the work you finished properly. Carver tied his horse at the front of the house like a man who expected to be received, which he was. Cooper came to the pen fence an hour later. "Army man at the house wants to talk to you. Remount contract out of Fort Hays. 6 months. Good money." Emmett brought the stallion to a stop, both ears forward. "I will talk to him." Carver was direct, and the offer was genuine. More money than most men saw in a year. He leaned forward across the table at supper. "The job here can wait. Cooper will find another man." Emmett looked at the table between them. "I do not leave work half done." Carver studied him a moment, then picked up his hat and left. That evening, Cooper came to the fence and stood longer than usual. "That is a considerable amount of money to walk away from." Emmett kept his eyes on the horse. "I started something here." Cooper watched the stallion move through the last of the light. "So you did." He pushed off the fence and walked back toward the house. Emmett stayed at the rail until the dark came all the way in. Holt came back 2 weeks later. He arrived purposefully, greeted Cooper briefly, and came down toward the north pen with the look of a man who had decided something while he was away. Emmett was in the barn working on a cracked cinch ring when he heard it. That particular high sound a frightened horse makes, short and sharp, followed by hooves against hard ground. He was through the barn door before the echo died. The stallion was against the far fence, eyes wide, hindquarters tucked, a lead rope trailing in the dirt. Holt stood just outside the gate, one hand on the rail, his expression recalculating. Elsie was already inside the pen. She had put herself between the horse and the fence, with one hand flat on his neck and her mouth close to his ear, her voice too low to carry, but steady, the same register she used at the fence every morning. The stallion's breathing was ragged. Then it began to slow. Emmett came through the gate and moved to the horse's other side, running his hands along the flank. Fine tremors in the muscle, but the worst of it was passing. Elsie kept her hand on his neck. Emmett did not ask her to move it. They stood on either side of the animal in the quiet of the pen and let him come back to himself. Cooper was at the fence. He had come from the direction of the water trough, a wrench still in his hand, and he stood at the rail with the expression of a man who had seen exactly what he needed to see and wished he had not needed to see it. Holt turned from outside the gate. "I only meant to move things along. I did not think he would react that way." Cooper set the wrench on the top rail. He looked at his daughter standing in the center of the pen with her hand on the stallion's neck. He looked at Emmett beside her. He was quiet for a long time. "Ride safe going home," he finally said to Holt. Not unkindly, just with the finality of a man closing a door he should have looked at more carefully before he opened it. Holt read the room the way intelligent men do when they understand they have already lost something. He nodded once and went to get his horse. Cooper came to find Elsie that evening. Emmett saw none of it. But the next morning, Elsie came to the fence with something different in the way she stood. Not lighter exactly. More like a woman who had set something down after carrying it a long way. She watched the stallion for a while without speaking. Then she said her father had told her the previous evening that he would not be pressing the match with Holt, that he had been more interested in what it looked like than in what it was, that he was sorry it had taken him this long to say so. She delivered it plainly, without ornament, but her hands were loose on the rail instead of gripping it. Emmett looked at the horse. "You all right?" Elsie considered the question honestly. "I think so." The stallion came to the near side of the pen and stood looking at them both with his ears forward, the way he stood now when he had decided the people nearby were worth being close to. Emmett stayed in the pen late that evening, doing the small work of the day, the kind of tasks that give a man something to do with his hands when his mind is working on something else. Elsie came back after supper. She stood at the rail and watched him without speaking. When he finally walked to the fence, she did not have the look of a woman about to say something practical and leave. He stopped on his side of the rail. He looked at her straight shoulders, the way she stood like a woman braced for the order of things to reassert itself. "I have moved on from every place I have ever worked." He let that sit a moment. "I do not want to move on from you." She was still. The last light was going, and the yard was quiet around them. Then she reached across the top rail and took his hand in both of hers and held it the way you hold something you have been waiting a long time to hold, careful and certain, without any performance in it at all. The stallion moved easy in the pen behind him. Somewhere across the yard, a lamp came on in the house. Cooper came to the north pen the next morning before the ranch was fully awake. Emmett was already there. The stallion stood quiet at the center of the pen, watching them both with his ears forward. Cooper looked at the horse for a long moment. She was right about the South Corral. "First week he was here, I did not listen." Emmett said nothing. "Been a long time since somebody on this ranch knew horses the way she does. Been a long time since I let her show it." He looked at the stallion in the morning light. Then he looked at Emmett with the eyes of a man who had been wrong about something and was done being wrong about it. "You would stay on?" Emmett met his eyes. "Yes." Cooper turned and looked at the fence his daughter had stood at every morning for 3 weeks, and then at the east pasture beyond, pale and wide in the early light. "Build on the east side. Ground is better there." He walked back toward the house. They were married in November in the small church in Cheyenne, where the Union Pacific whistles could still be heard on a clear day, carrying cattle and commerce east toward markets that had never stopped wanting Wyoming beef. The stallion was in the east pasture by then, doing what he had been bought to do. Not broken, not conquered, just settled into the life that had been patient enough to wait for him. The second house went up through the winter on the east ground plain, and well made, finished by early spring. By the time the first real warmth came, Elsie was carrying their child, moving through her days the way she had always moved, unhurried and straight-backed, certain of the ground beneath her feet. Some mornings, Cooper sat on his porch, and watched the east pasture where the stallion moved through the pale early light along the fence line, easy and steady, belonging to the place, the way good animals eventually do. Across the yard, smoke rose from the chimney of the second house. The ranch went on. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Emmett and Elsie. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and share it with someone who could use a gentle frontier story tonight. We will be here when you are ready for another.